Good morning. All right, just testing. Running a bit behind this morning. Desiree and I had a bit of a tough morning parenting wise, so I'm running a bit behind. I/we, but we're here. We're ready to start. Um, let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study your word. We thank you for this great book of Genesis that gives us insight as to how you began things, God, in this with this world that we live in. Just help us to take lessons from it and find ways to apply them to our lives. And we also ask that you help us at this time to clear our minds of anything that might be distracting us, so that we can give full attention to what you have to teach us through your word. Be with those that are sick and traveling, and that might have any other kind of struggles, Father, and forgive us when we fall short of the example that you've set for us through your Son, Jesus Christ. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, let's be opening up to Genesis chapter 7. Last week we studied about Noah, and we did that to kind of segue into what we're going to be talking about both today and next week. And this is about the flood. It's a very familiar story, I think, to all of us, but there's a lot to be learned from this story. So we are going to be slowing down a bit and spending a couple weeks on the flood story, because there is a lot that's involved here. Now, before we get into that, what we need to be reminded of is that what brings us to this point in God's Word, we call it context. We read about after the death of Cain and Abel, God gave to Adam and Eve another son named Seth, who would be the ancestor of this man named Noah that we talked about. He was amongst all the corruption that existed in the world at his time. Noah was found to be righteous in the sight of God along with his family. So with that in mind, when we read chapter 6 of Genesis, we find that Noah would be the one selected to build an ark that would function to save him and a few others from a coming destruction that God would bring on the earth in the form of a global flood. And as I've already alluded to, this would come as a result of the mass corruption of mankind that is also described in chapter 6, along with the instructions as to how Noah built the ark. So it's the events of chapter 6 that bring us to the things we're going to be studying today from the text of chapter 7, where we find the first of really a two-part story concerning the global flood that God brought upon the earth, which destroyed all of the creation, again with the exception of Noah and his family, and a select group of animals that would be left alive on the ark with Noah. Now, with this being true, what we're going to do today is going to consider for ourselves 2 points and a summarizing statement that are revealed in the 24 verses that make up chapter 7. But it begins with the text saying there in verse 1, "Then the Lord said to Noah, 'Enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time.'" Now, what is verse 1 telling us? Absolutely. Why? Why is Noah the one going on the ark according to verse 1? Okay, that's true. But what about Noah? Why is Noah going on the ark according to verse 1? Because he is righteous. So, it's time to get on the ark. God says, "Noah, get on the ark, you and your household," which is another word for family, "because you have been found to be righteous." Another way of saying he's right with God. So, with that being true, what we're going to see in verses 2 through 24 has already been said. We're going to look at a couple points about the flood that culminates in the author of Genesis recording for us the entire period of time the flood lasted in verse 24 of this chapter before it would begin to recede in chapter 8. So, what we're going to see is part 1 is the flood itself. its coming. And then chapter 8 next time is going to be about how the flood begins to recede and what that all leads up to. But following these 2 points that we're going to look at, the author of Genesis will summarize by telling us the total amount of days that the flood remained on the earth. Now, what we will learn from these things, some application of it, is that the flood story should encourage us to remain faithful to God. Why? Because this story serves as an example of what will happen to us depending on whether or not we choose to follow God. So that in mind, we'll just begin with the first point, and that's in verses 2 through 12. We'll go ahead and read those verses. It says, "You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female, also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made." Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth. Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. Of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. It came about after the 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so verses 2 through 12, the first point we're going to look at is just how long the rain that caused the flood, amongst other things, fell. Now, what we learn from verses 2 through 12, the main point getting across there, is that the flood rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. My wife was just talking to Jenny about that the other night. But this point is introduced with God giving the command to Noah in verses 2 and giving a command in verses 2 and 3. Now, in those 2 verses, what is God doing? What is he telling Noah to do? What do you notice? Right. So it's the animals that that are beginning to be listed out here. So yes, that's the first thing we notice, that Noah was to take on the ark animals that consisted of a male and a female. What are some other observations you make of verses 2 and 3? You've got the male and the female, but what else? It's to include clean animals. Okay, absolutely. And in what number of groups were those clean animals to be taken? By sevens, is what the text says. And that's along with the birds that are to be taken by sevens. Now, this is a way of saying that that 7 pairs of these animals will be taken on the ark, male, female. But on the other hand, you also have the unclean animals who are to be taken by 2, meaning 2 pairs of these ritually unclean animals were the ones to be taken aboard the ark. Now, why is God, according to verse 3, why is God doing this with the animals? What's the ultimate goal based on the end of verse 3? Okay, that's one way of looking at it, absolutely. The text says to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So we could say so that God didn't have to recreate them. So that's why these animals and these groups are going on the ark, because the animals are going to be repopulated after the flood. And we'll talk about that next time. Go ahead, Dean. Mhm. In the case of the clean animals, those were going on by sevens, which is a way of saying 7 pairs, but consisting of male and female. So, yeah. In the case of the clean animals, yeah. So that's what the by sevens means. Um, so that's a good point slash question. So it seems there was less clean animals than there were unclean, or less unclean animals than there were clean, because the numbers are different. So any other questions or comments on verses 2 and 3? That's possible. Um, Yeah, I mean, when you look at children's versions of this story, they picture it just this little boat with all the animals. This thing was huge. And one reason we know that is because in the military, I don't want to get off on this tangent, but I'm going to. A lot of military boats have been built after the dimensions of the ark. Um, I wish I had one to show you, but I don't. So yes, in our minds, it seems crowded, and it was, but God provided the space for these animals to survive during the flood, and not to mention Noah and his family. Anything else on verses 2 and 3? Okay. Now moving on to verse 4. Why is God doing this? What's he going to do? It's going to kill everything. He's going to send rain after a week's time. It says, for after 7 more days, I will send rain on the earth. And it's going to last for 40 days and 40 nights. That's where we see it. And the purpose of this is to kill everything, everything and everyone. This is animals and people. So that's verse 4. Verse 2 and 3 are the instructions. Verse 4, here's why. And verse 5 summarizes Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. We've looked at that phrase before, in that Noah did exactly as God told him to do. Dean, go ahead. I have, multiple times. Okay. And that's probably what this would have been, is major rain, because of how long it would last. Anything else on verses 4 and 5? Okay. Now going on into verse 6, how old was Noah? 600 years old. That's what verse 6 tells us. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. It'd be a lot of candles. So in this verse, yes, the author of Genesis is simply just recording for us how old Noah was when the flood rain would come. Now, something else we should know, based on what we read in verse 14 of chapter 8 that we're going to look at next week, as to how old Noah was when the flood ended, what we can also say that what the author records here functions to record for us a time frame as to when the flood began, beginning with the rainfall that would begin to give rise to the flood. So having recorded that in verses 7 through 9, the author records briefly the entrance of Noah's family and the chosen animals into the ark. Now, among the things that are listed here in verses 7 through 9, the point of emphasis seems to be that Noah's family and the animals entered the ark because of the water of the flood. That's the whole reason they're getting on the boat, is because of this flood that's coming, and you guys know that. Now, if that's the point of emphasis in these verses, the point the author is making in verses 7 through 9 is that the reason Noah's family and the animals boarded the ark is because of the flood that this rain would cause. Questions or comments on that? I know we're moving quickly through it. Okay. Now that brings us into verse 10. It says there, it came about after the 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth. And what's this verse telling us based on the context? Okay, that's possible, but what does verse 4 tell us, Jeremiah? Okay. Okay, so that's possible, but what we also need to keep in mind is verse 4. God had already said 7 more days this rain's coming. So it is possible that it took a week's time, but the text doesn't tell us that specifically. So what we're seeing here is simply a fulfillment of God's warning. A week after the instructions had been given, God brought the rain that would ultimately flood the earth. So it's at this point, after the 7 days, that Noah, his family, and the animals all would be on board the ark. Now, since that's true, in verse 11, the author of Genesis records for us in more detail the age of Noah when these things occurred, and he adds that it was at this time all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So first we have a repetition of the age. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all these things happen. Now, can anyone tell me what these fountains of the great deep and the floodgates of the sky refer to? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Jeremiah? Mm-hmm. That's it. And Jeremiah's absolutely right. This is talking about Genesis chapter 1. God contained the water in different places above and below. But at this point in the flood, all of that's bursting open. And it would cause this global flood that we know this to be. Now, we've said before that the flood we read about here in Genesis 7 is unlike any other flood this world has ever seen. Floods still happen, but not to this degree. But again, going back to what Jeremiah said, that's absolutely correct. God isolated the water in different places in order to form the dry land. But now all of that's just be let loose. So what seems to be happening with that in mind, with the creation account in mind, God is basically undoing everything he's done in the creation. Some people have called this an uncreation. It's a renewal of sorts. But everything's being undone through this flood. Everything's destroyed except, again, for Noah, his family, and the animals that are on the ark. Questions or comments on verse 11? Yep, and that's something we're going to deal with next time. So, anything else on verse 11? Okay. Now, verse 12, how long did the rain fall? 40 days, 40 nights. Now, this is a summarizing statement from verses 2 through 12. Now, we know that this is a summarizing statement because up to this point, the author has recorded God's fulfillment of his warning that rain would come. 7 days after the instructions given in verse at the beginning of the chapter. So the rain would fall on the earth for a 40-day and night period, after which the flood waters would begin to rise and cover the whole earth in water. So, since the author summarizes in this way, we can see that the point, verse 2 through 12, is that the flood rain would last for 40 days and nights. Now, in these verses, God issues a warning to Noah that in a week's time, a rain that would last 40 days would begin to fall. Noah would have 7 days to consider what God had commanded him. As Jeremiah said, get everything on the boat. From verse 5, we know that Noah did respond to these things in obedience and did what God commanded him to do. And so since Noah did respond in obedience to these things, he, his family, and the animals would be brought safely through the flood. Now that brings us into verses 13 through 23, where we begin to read that the flood water increased for an additional 40 days. We'll just read that. It says, now it came about in the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong chapter. I flipped my page. Verse 13 of chapter 7. On the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them, entered the ark, they and every beast after its kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, all sorts of birds. So they went up into the ark to Noah by twos of all flesh, in which was the breath of life. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. All flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. Of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those who were with him in the ark. Okay, so verses 13 through 16. What is the author doing there? Okay, so that's part of it. But what happens first in verse 13? Verse 13. Noah and his family enter the ark. And what did you say, Jeremiah? The people. So yeah, in this case, Noah, and as Matt pointed out, they enter the ark. Now, if we put that with the rest of with verse 14 through 16, is that even though this is another account of Noah's family and the animals entering the ark, these verses serve to emphasize the fact that Noah and his family took seriously what God communicated about the coming flood. Now, based on verse 16 of this section, what the author is also emphasizing in these verses is not only the entrance to the ark, but also that once aboard the ark, Noah, his family, and the animals would be kept safe from the flood. By virtue of the fact that upon their entrance, what would God do based on the end of verse 16? What did God do when they got on the ark? He shut them in. God closed the door. Doesn't say Noah closed the door. It says God did it. They're on the ark. God closes the door. So having established these points, in verses 17 through 20, the author gives a detailed description of how the water moved as the water levels increased over a 40-day period. Now, verse 17, what does the author tell us about the water? Water increased and lifted up the ark. And it says so that it rose above the earth. So now the water's coming up, and the ark is being carried by the water above the surface of the earth. Now, one reason we know that this is what the author is saying is because of that phrase, lift it up. When you lift something up, you take it off the ground. So that dry ground is gone, and the ark is floating up above the otherwise dry ground. So building on that, in verse 18, the author tells us that the water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. Now, can anyone tell me what the word prevailed means? What's that, Dean? Yeah. Overcome is one word we could plug in there. So the water's taking over. It's becoming stronger and stronger. That's what the word prevailed has to do with. And so the floodwaters are becoming stronger and stronger, but they're keeping the ark afloat. Now that idea is repeated in verse 20. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, can anyone tell me how much a cubit is? 18 inches. Multiply that by 15, you get roughly 22 and a half feet. That water was 22 and a half feet deep, deeper than the deepest point of a swimming pool. So with this in mind, the author is recording for us that at this point in the story, the water levels increased to 22 and a half feet higher than they were when the flood began. And this was high enough to cover the mountains. Now again, we should remember that the reason this was made possible is because God's undoing everything that he's created with the waters that we read about in Genesis 1. Questions or comments on verses 19 or 20? Okay. So this brings us to verses 21 through 23. Now turning from his description from the increasing levels of water, in verses 21 through 23, the author turns his attention to the loss of life that occurred during the 40 days that the earth was being flooded. Now, in these verses, the author is once again summarizing, and in these verses, he's more specifically summarizing the destruction of human and animal life that occurred during the 40 days that the earth was being flooded. But the point of emphasis and observation we should make is there in verse 22. What does verse 22 tell us? How is man described in that verse? Now, go ahead. The spirit of life. This is a way of saying that everything God had breathed life into, we might say, or given life to, died. God took that life away. More undoing of the creation. Now, this loss of life is also emphasized in the fact that in verse 23, the author says what? And who was left? Yeah, not. Okay. I hadn't noticed that, but you're right. Upon the face of the land. Well, God could do it if he wanted to, so yeah. Yeah. That's true. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good point. So, but again, who was left after the face of the land things are destroyed? All those safe in the ark. Noah, his family, and the animals. So, as in verse 11 of this chapter, here in verse 21 through 23, what we should see is that in the flooding of the earth, God is undoing the creation. Now, this is something that God intentionally did, because as we read in Genesis 6, verse 6, God was sorry that he'd made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. It's for this reason that one commentator says of the flood what I've already said, that the flood was a sort of uncreation, where God uncreated everything that he had created over the 6 days of creation. So, putting verses 17 through 23 together, the point we should see from these verses is that the flood water increased over a period of 40 days. So you had the rain fall for 40 days and everything attached to that. But then the flood waters were rising over a period of 40 days. Now, what we should also understand here is that the 40 days the earth was being flooded was in addition to the 40 days of rainfall. So up to this point, the events surrounding the flood are going on for at least 80 days. And it's going to go longer than that. So God is flooding every inch of the earth. The result? Massive loss of human and animal life. Now, when you think about it that way, the flood was one of the most violent events of human history because of how much life was lost during that time. So verse 24, the author summarizes, the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now again, what does the word prevailed mean? Okay, continued. But Don, what did you say prevailed meant earlier? Overcome. So becoming, and they add overcoming as a result of strength. So the author of Genesis is recording for us that the floodwaters continue to become stronger over a period of 150 days. Now with that in mind, the first thing we should understand here is that the 150-day period the author describes here includes the 40 days that the earth was being flooded following the 40-day rain. Now, since that's true, this tells us that the 24 verses that make up chapter 7 of Genesis, this encompasses a period roughly of 197 days. That's if you include the 7 days before the rain began to fall, when God gave Noah the instructions of verses 2 through 5. Now, the number also tells us, that 197 tells us that after 40 days of flooding, the floodwaters remained on the earth for an additional 110 days before they would begin to subside in chapter 8. Now, one reason we know this is because in verse 3 of chapter 8, we're told that at the end of the 150-day period, the floodwaters began to recede from the earth as a result of God sending the wind that is described in verse 1, which again we'll talk about next time. So when we consider everything that we've looked at in chapter 7 of Genesis, the point we should be left with is that God flooded the earth, leaving Noah, his family, and a few pairs of animals to survive aboard the ark. The rain fell for 40 days. Floodwaters increased for 40 days. Finally, the floodwater lasted for 150 days. And that tells me I might have done my math wrong, but I'll go back and correct that. Now, with that in mind, the application of these things to us is that we, like Noah, actually, no, I did do, the 197 was correct because I didn't include the rain falling in that number. Now, the application of these things to us is that we, like Noah, can be saved if we serve God faithfully. Now, looking ahead to chapter 8, we know that one thing God does following the flood is that he promises, chapters 8 and 9, I should say, is that he promises to never destroy the earth in this way again. Now, even though that's the case, we know from other passages of Scripture, including in the New Testament, that what God did for Noah and his family, along with the animals, that serves as an example of what will happen to us depending on how we choose to live our lives. Now, just one passage that comes to mind is over in Peter. It uses the imagery of Noah in this event to show how baptism saves us. But that's just one passage. So if we live our life serving God, we'll be saved from God's judgment on the earth that's coming, not in the form of a flood, but in the form of something else. But if we choose not to serve God, we'll be caught in the flood of God's judgment on the earth. Now, we can know this is the application of chapter 7 to us because as we read on in our Bibles, there are multiple passages that point back to the flood event to warn us against sinful lifestyles and to encourage us to live in faithfulness to God. Now, with that in mind, Genesis chapter 7 should serve as an encouragement to us who are seeking to live faithfully toward God and to help others do the same. That's your whirlwind tour of chapter 7. Any other questions or comments?